Welcome to Unit 7, Lesson 7, The Pull of the West. If you had trouble finding work and heard about opportunities in a completely different part of the country, you might just pack up and move. That's exactly what settlers from the eastern half of the United States did in the 19th century. They packed up and moved west. Opening the West. The boundaries of the nation shifted dramatically in the early 19th century, and the westward migration of Easterners profoundly changed American culture. The West inspired ideals of individualism, or a self-reliant independence, and a rugged frontier life that dramatically influenced our national self-image and sense of the American past. In the early 19th century, Americans began to explore, move to, and live in the West. In 1806, Zebulon Pike led an expedition to discover the headwaters of the Arkansas River and was one of the first white men to explore the wilderness of Colorado. Many of these adventurous individuals were fur trappers and explorers called mountain men. They spent most of their time in the wilderness trapping small animals for furs. Every summer, from about 1825 to 1840, trappers met with fur traders at temporary markets called rendezvous to sell and buy goods and supplies. Trade opportunities like this were one of the economic incentives that drew people to the West. Several mountain men became legendary. Kit Carson was a successful fur trapper in California, would later use his skills to guide U.S. Army officers in a war with Mexico. Another legend was Jedediah Smith. Smith had read of Lewis and Clark's expeditions and decided to explore the West for himself. He would eventually explore more of the unknown territory in the West than any other single person. In 1826, Smith crossed the Mojave Desert into Southern California. The next year, he hiked through California's high mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and became the first white American to travel overland from the east to California and back. Another mountain man who explored the Sierra Nevada was Jim Beckwourth. He had been born into slavery but was set free when he was 25. In 1850, he discovered a mountain pass through the Sierra Nevada for settlers to follow as they traveled to Northern California. Today, that pass is still called Beckwourth Pass. The mountain men's explorations opened lands that previously seemed inaccessible. After the Panic of 1837, many Americans faced economic difficulties. Newly explored lands in the West started to look attractive to unhappy Easterners, new immigrants, independent women, and others who were seeking a new start. In 1845, magazine editor John O'Sullivan wrote an editorial urging the United States to annex, or add, Texas as a state. He also wrote that the Americans had a manifest destiny to overspread and possess the whole of the continent. The word manifest means obvious, and destiny refers to the unavoidable events of the future. The phrase and the purpose underlying manifest destiny reflected several cultural assumptions, including the certainty that the United States would, indeed, should, one day stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Those who embraced this concept were driven by more than just the promise of new opportunities. O'Sullivan's editorial described a belief that God intended for white Protestant Americans to take over the continent. Such an idea blatantly ignored the fact that there were already people living on these lands. For several decades, the federal government pursued the territorial acquisition of western lands. The Oregon Territory promised timber, furs, and rich fisheries. California offered fertile farmland and abundant mineral resources, and both California and Oregon provided ports on the Pacific Ocean for seaboard merchants to ship and receive goods. Texas had deposits of minerals and metals, such as silver. The desire for riches and the belief in manifest destiny inspired settlers and politicians to move westward. Manifest destiny. John O'Sullivan might have thought he was onto something when he coined the phrase manifest destiny. However, he could not have predicted the impact that Americans' movement west would have on the nation's identity. For the 19th century, Americans already considered moving westward. The idea of manifest destiny, that they had not only had the right, but also the responsibility to help expand the nation, was quite appealing. Settlers by the hundreds began crossing the Mississippi River and heading west. John Gast's 1872 painting, American Progress, depicts the spirit of America as a goddess-like woman, bathed in light and floated westward. She is leading pioneers or people moving to a new and unfamiliar land as they leave their settled lives and communities behind. The spirit carries a school book, and she strings telegraph wire as she moves across the open land. Notice Gast's use of light and dark in this painting, and how Native Americans and wildlife seem to react to the people headed their way. Gast painted American Progress just a few years after the end of the Civil War. In some ways, the painting's themes of modernization and new frontiers reflect a cultural desire to be. Gast painted American Progress just a few years after the end of the Civil War. In some ways, the painting's themes of modernization and new frontiers reflect a cultural desire to begin anew. Just a quick review before we end this video. Manifest destiny was the idea that the United States had the right and obligation to expand its territory across North America to the Pacific Ocean. Mountain men were the American fur trappers and explorers who began to explore and move west. The Oregon Territory promised timber, furs, rich fisheries. California offered fertile farmland and abundant mineral resources, and both California and Oregon provided ports on the Pacific Ocean for seaboard merchants to ship and receive goods. Texas held deposits of minerals and metals such as silver. Newly explored lands in the West started to look attractive to unhappy Easterners, new immigrants, independent women, and others who were seeking a new start. That's all for today's video.